I want to congratulate you in advance for the stamina you will have displayed by the time this session is over. As for myself, I haven't done the numbers, but I suspect that at some point my own body will tell me I should be profoundly asleep during this session. But if I can stay awake, perhaps you can as well. I'm going to assume for the purposes of this discussion that the dialectic or debate concerning general or professional education applies to the curriculum of the undergraduate college, not to the professional schools, or to the high school curriculum. And I'm going to assume further that the issue is how to educate many, perhaps most, perhaps a great majority of young people in a democratic society. Now, in that context, the question is usually framed as a difference between a narrowly framed program concentrating on immediately useful knowledge that prepares people for life as it is, which was already referred to, and a broader program that prepares people for a life of free contemplation with no immediate project or immediate payoff in sight. Advocates of professional education sometimes argue that general education is an elitist program of cultural privilege for those with assured futures, which Gabby already referred to this morning, while professional education is the more democratic option for those who need to make it through their own effort and on their own merits. General education proponents respond by saying that a curriculum centered on jobs and vocations is anti-democratic in another respect and constitutes an arbitrary and insulting restriction of human capabilities. We can see early stirrings of this debate as far back as 1693, when John Locke complained that undergraduates, middle-class people going to Oxford and Cambridge, who were learning the post-Renaissance version of the humanistic, of the scholastic tradition, were filling their heads with a deal of trash instead of learning useful things like how to write a good hand and casting accounts. Locke was among the first to argue for what we might call professional training, the casting of accounts indicating the stirrings of a mercantile economy, in favor of Latin, the classics, or theology. But Locke included in his recommended curriculum other things the university was also not teaching, including geography, astronomy, anatomy, and Aesop's fables. In other words, even accountants, in Locke's ideal view, had to be able to gaze in wonderment at the stars and imagine the insides of the body and recite moralizing fables. For Locke, the professional included elements of the general. And this confusion of the two principles, now often considered separate and distinct, was even more pronounced in the American university system at the time, where the primary purpose of the first university, Harvard, was to provide ministers with the kind of education needed to keep alive in the settlements the Protestant faith, which depended on the ability of everyone to read the Bible and other devotional texts, including, for example, Pilgrim's Progress. At Harvard, the education required of those entering the profession of the ministry was essentially general education. The Puritans, John Adams argued, had become intolerable in England because they insisted on becoming intelligent in general, and served equally immediate needs for literacy and for distant goals like the salvation of the soul. A somewhat more recognizably modern form of this debate begins to take shape in late 18th century America when people like Adams and Thomas Jefferson talked about the kind of education that citizens of a democracy ought to have. Now, contemporary humanists like me generally love the liberal cast of their discussion, but actually neither of these two men anticipated an educational system that would encompass the majority of the citizens. Jefferson talked about raking 1 in 20 from the rubbish of the general population and devoting resources to educating that one. And Adams thought mostly about his own progeny and other people similarly situated. But both of them fully grasped the difference between an education focused on immediate needs and utilities and what they considered a richer and more various kind of education that exposed students to the depth and complexity of the world, heaping scorn on the former and praise on the latter. A real education, Jefferson wrote, should include such disciplines as pneumatics, mathematics, chemistry, law, mechanics, languages, history, literature, a program that we might call general education, but which included components of professional education, the law. That's how Jefferson learned his law. They did not think that languages and history were useless, quite the opposite. For them, this was the kind of education most suited both to a democracy and to human nature as they understood it. For them, general education was professionally relevant and, in fact, indispensable for those who were expected to be self-governing and independent. So, just to draw this distinction a little too crisply, For the Puritans, professional education, education for the ministry, included general education, general literacy. And for Jefferson and Adams, general education included the professional. So there was no clear distinction between these two. What I'm suggesting then is that the distinction that we see today between general and professional education is actually a late blooming flower of recent emergence. We see that distinction hardening in the American system in the post-war climate of the mid-20th century, when a broadly liberal general education for both secondary and post-secondary curricula became national policy. This is the democratization of these more elite programs of general education that Gabi mentioned earlier that took root at the University of Chicago, Columbia University, and other places. Post-war, this program of elite general education, education for the leadership class, was adapted to the needs of the entire population, and it was thought that that all secondary students, as well as all post-secondary students, should have a liberal education on the general education model. General education at this time, mid-20th century, was explicitly opposed to professional education, but even here, the distinction was not drawn between useful and useless knowledge. Indeed, the general education system was thought to be urgently needed in order to build the country, transform the society, and model for the world what democracy was all about. The document that translated theory into practice was the Truman Report, 6 volumes with the title Higher Education for Democracy. In other words, explicitly announcing the utility. It's only quite recently, perhaps the last 40 years or so, that ostensibly serious people began to argue that the distinction between professional and general education turned on the difference between the knowledge necessary to get jobs and drive the economy and the knowledge that led off to dreamland. In the 1970s, business and corporate interests advocated relentlessly and successfully for the transformation of the massive community college system in the United States, which was designed to take students who were not yet or directly ready for four-year colleges and feed them into four-year colleges if that's what they desired. They argued for the transformation of this system into, from a liberal arts program into a program essentially designed for job training. A system designed to socialize the costs of job training without, of course, socializing the profits associated with those jobs. The argument in favor of education as job training has more recently been applied to, or rather I should say deployed against, colleges and universities, and has been taken up by politicians, including many state legislatures and virtually every Republican now running for the presidency. Partisan and economic interests have decided that they have a stake in enforcing a distinction between what they argue are two fundamentally different approaches to education, which they cast as the difference between a realistic and contemporary system that addresses real-world needs and a traditional system catering to the interests of the tenured, ideologically driven professoriate. Those who make this clear distinction often claim that while mass liberal education may have served a purpose back in the day, the world has turned. People now face hard choices in an unforgiving world that is unpredictable, volatile, increasingly complex. Society, they say, must take care to give people the means to provide for themselves, and the educational system is the way to do that. But one may ask, and I do here ask, when was the world ever simple and predictable to those who lived in it? Since when has a culture been threatened by the full development of human capabilities? Since when have the needs of individuals and of society been met by restricting interests, blocking sympathies, and diminishing imaginative capacities? These questions are particularly relevant in light of the fact that in most countries the educational system is run, overseen, and funded by the state. This means that students have to be regarded not only as units of self-interested competitive zeal or as a pliant workforce for private business, but also as citizens in whose flourishing the nation has a stake. The nation wants its citizens to succeed as individuals, of course that goes without saying, but it also needs them to have some sense of a collective identity, with a strong investment in certain moral, intellectual, and historical cultural traditions. The state has a very real interest in the long term. Now this last point I think is most important with respect to the complexity, volatility, unpredictability, and so forth. All those things that keep accelerating, increasing, worsening, making life incomprehensible and threatening to everybody. These fear factors are often invoked as part of the rationale for devoting the educational apparatus to job training. A job, it's said, will stabilize one's life and neutralize the threats of the world. But is this the right inference to draw? Might we not, with equal or perhaps even greater justice, say that an education devoted to training in a vocation or profession is precisely the wrong kind to prepare people to look after themselves in a complex, volatile, unpredictable, and so forth world? Against the grain of the prevailing forces in my own society, I would argue that a broad liberal education, with subjects being studied for their own sake, is the best preparation for the world of today. And I'm going to lay particular emphasis on that for their own sake, because I think that that has practical value. In fact, I would argue the value of studying things for their own sake is realized very directly in the professional world. In a liberal education, one moves among fields without becoming overly committed to or invested in any of them. And this negative attribute is the ground of other positive attributes, which include flexibility, creativity, an ability to innovate or improvise. Charles Vest, who was the president at the time of MIT, once said that he thought that the current increasingly fragile advantage of American scientists derived from the fact that all of them had a liberal education. And this, he said, made them more able than others whose training was more highly focused to become innovators, to solve problems by combining them or recasting them, to explore neglected subjects, to become not just competent in their field but leaders in their field. Cannot the same be said for professions generally, that a broad liberal education equips people not just to do the job placed in front of them, but to do many jobs, to abandon the job when it no longer repays the effort, or to invent other jobs? Perhaps, in short, the hard distinction between general and professional education reflects an outdated understanding of the nature of professionalism. People named Baker do not, in today's world, generally bake. Very few barrels are made by coopers. Carpenters are not condemned to a lifetime of woodworking. Professions are no longer identities. They change, and the skills required for them change as well. Successful professionals in today's world are those who have the ability to make adjustments within or between professions. The most essential attribute for a professional in a volatile, unpredictable, and so forth world is not skill in a particular task, which really constitutes a kind of professional death sentence, but professionalism in general, a broadly conceived set of capabilities including the ability to learn new things, to work with people of different kinds, to adapt, to improvise, to change courses. These are not developed by an education that encourages the student to believe that his or her future well-being is tied to expertise in a single skill or a single field. I recently heard one of the richest men in my country argue for technological high schools by saying the next great programmer, actually said it in a southern accent, which I won't try to imitate for you, next great programmer is not going to come from a liberal arts program. But, I wanted to say, programming is not our only need. And even more to the point, the tech industry was not built on programming alone, but on vision. And where did the great tech visionaries of the past come from? They may have been dropouts, but they dropped out of liberal arts programs at Stanford, Reed College, or Harvard. The best kind of professional education, I would submit, would return to, or maybe I should say insist on the durability of, an earlier conception in which no bright line separated general from professional education. I'm not arguing for a return to earlier actual educational practices, for I expect and desire that the content and methods of education will exhibit a ceaseless experimental churn as knowledge advances and the world turns, and as pressures of the present encounter a hopefully productive resistance from people who are invested in the ways of knowing of the past. Which I think is actually very, very useful, this resistance from academia to the immediate pressures of the present. Otherwise, without this resistance, we would just lurch from one apocalyptic solution to the next with no continuity among them and no way of measuring progress or decline. And I also think that the needs of a given community should in many cases be reflected in the educational system of that community. I know colleges centered in a town withdraw their student body from the local area, and there is one plant in the town. And I think it would be absurd if the educational system did not respect that fact, that most of their students are going to get jobs associated with this industry. But the idea of a broad liberal education for citizens at large is an educational and a social principle not likely to be abandoned, especially not for the sake of a mistaken idea of present needs. Thank you.